Hey guys, tonight I want to take you somewhere that feels both deeply familiar and quietly unbelievable. Somewhere that existed not in the distant past, not in some foreign country, but right here in America, just a few decades ago. A world where the rules were looser, the dangers were mostly invisible, and nobody thought twice about the things that would make a modern person's jaw drop straight to the floor. Before we get into it, I just want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. He sent it in such a thoughtful way, and honestly, the moment I read it, I knew we had to make it. You will keep this channel alive, and I mean that every single time I say it. If you're new here, welcome. We make these long, slow, story-style videos about American history and everyday life, the kind you can watch in bed with the lights low, or just let run while you fall asleep. We're also now on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen, the link is in the description. And if any of this sounds like your kind of thing, a like and a subscribe would mean the world. Now, get comfortable, pull the blanket up, dim the lights if you haven't already, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Because I want you to think for a moment about what everyday American life actually felt like in the 1970s. Not the movies, not the music, not the bell-bottoms on the magazine rack. The actual, ordinary, Tuesday afternoon reality of it. What did a neighbourhood smell like when half the cars on the street were still burning leaded gasoline? What did it feel like to sit in a diner where the ashtray on your table was considered a courtesy? What did a father think when he handed his 10-year-old a couple of quarters and sent him to the corner store with a note for cigarettes? Did it feel reckless? Did it feel normal? Did it feel like anything at all? What was it like to ride in the back of a station wagon with no seatbelt, the whole family sliding around on a vinyl bench seat on the way to Sunday dinner? What did a child think when the teacher rolled in the film strip projector and the whole classroom smelled faintly of warm plastic and chalk dust? What did summer sound like when kids were outside from dawn until the streetlights came on, playing with toys that would be recalled in a heartbeat today? And just like that, it is 1973. The television is on in the next room. Someone down the block is mowing their lawn with a mower that leaks oil. The refrigerator hums. A cigarette burns in a glass ashtray on the kitchen counter, and nobody thinks anything of it at all. Come on in. The door is open. Every time someone pulled into a gas station in the 1970s, they made a choice that barely felt like a choice at all. You asked for regular or premium, the attendant topped off your tank, and you pulled back out onto the road trailing a thin invisible cloud of something nobody wanted to look at too closely. The gasoline was leaded and had been for decades, and the idea that it might be quietly poisoning the air your children were breathing on the way to school simply had not broken through into daily consciousness yet. You drove with the windows down, the radio played, the world smelled like exhaust and cut grass, and everything seemed fine. The gas station itself was a social place in those years. An attendant came out to meet you, wiped your windshield with a squeegee, checked the oil if you asked, and made conversation while the numbers on the pump ticked upward. The smell of gasoline was just the smell of going somewhere. It clung to your jacket and the carpet of the car and the air around the pump island, and nobody connected that smell to anything worrying. It was the smell of errands and road trips and Sunday afternoon drives. It was, in its way, the smell of freedom. Lead had been added to gasoline since the 1920s, introduced as a way to reduce engine knock and improve performance. By the time the 70s arrived, it had been part of the fuel supply for so long that questioning it felt roughly as strange as questioning the roads themselves. The cars were built around it. The refineries were calibrated for it. The entire infrastructure of American motoring assumed it. And so it continued. Pump after pump, mile after mile, the exhaust dispersing into the air over playgrounds and schoolyards and busy intersections, and the open windows of station wagons carrying children who were doing nothing more dangerous than looking out at the passing world, What scientists were beginning to understand, and what was only slowly filtering into public awareness, was that lead did not simply disappear once it left the exhaust pipe. It settled. It accumulated in soil along roadsides, in the dust of busy streets, in the air of neighbourhoods where traffic was heavy and ventilation was poor. Children playing outside in those neighbourhoods were absorbing it through their lungs and their skin, and the effects on the developing brain were not subtle. Attention, memory, behaviour. The things that make a child who they are were being quietly shaped by something invisible drifting out of the tailpipes of ordinary cars on ordinary days. The phase-out began in the mid-1970s, mandated by the Environmental Protection Agency, in stages gradual enough that most drivers barely noticed the transition. Unleaded pumps appeared alongside the old ones. New cars came with catalytic converters that required unleaded fuel to function. The change crept forward year by year, and by the time most people registered that something had shifted, the shift was already largely complete. The leaded pump handles eventually disappeared from the islands where they had stood for decades, and the air almost imperceptibly began to change. What is remarkable, looking back, is not that the change happened, but how long it took, and how little alarm surrounded the years before it. The evidence had been building for a long time. Researchers had raised concerns as far back as the 1920s, when workers at lead refineries began showing signs of serious neurological damage. Those concerns were managed, minimized, and set aside in the way that inconvenient evidence so often is, when an industry is large enough, and the habit is old enough, and the alternative requires rebuilding something from the ground up. You did not know any of this on an ordinary Tuesday in 1973. You pulled into the station, smelled the familiar sharp sweetness of the fuel, and watched the numbers climb. Your children were in the back seat. The windows were down. Someone on the radio was singing something you half knew. The attendant handed back your change and told you to have a good one, and you pulled out onto the road and drove toward whatever the day was holding, and the air closed behind you, and the world looked exactly as fine as it always had. That is the particular quality of the harms that move through daily life without announcement. They do not arrive with sirens. They do not interrupt the music on the radio. They settle into the ordinary texture of things and become part of what normal feels like. And by the time the full shape of them becomes visible, years have passed, and the damage is already woven into a generation of lives in ways that can never be fully measured. The roads are different now. The air near a busy intersection is different now, though it carries its own new questions. And somewhere in the soil along the edges of the highways where the heaviest traffic ran through those years, the residue of all those ordinary drives is still quietly present, a kind of geological record of a time when the choice at the pump felt like no choice at all. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before we move on, not in judgment, because the people filling their tanks in 1973 were doing what people always do, which is living inside the assumptions of their time, but in recognition that what we cannot see can still shape us in profound and lasting ways, and that sometimes the most significant things happening in a life are the ones that smell like nothing more than a summer drive with the windows down. There was a particular errand that was so common in the 1970s that nobody in most households gave it a second thought. A parent would finish the last cigarette in the pack, reach for their wallet, hand a child a few dollars, and say, "Run down to the corner store and pick me up a pack," and the child would go. No one at the counter asked questions. No one raised an eyebrow. The transaction was as ordinary as buying a loaf of bread or a bottle of soda, and the child would trot back home, pack in hand, feeling trusted and useful, without a single adult in the chain having paused to consider what that moment looked like from the outside. The corner store in those years was a different kind of institution than what replaced it. It was small and wooden-floored and smelled of newsprint and candy and something faintly dusty behind the counter where the cigarette cartons were stacked. The man behind the register knew your family. He knew your mother's brand without being told. He would take the note if you brought one, or sometimes he would not even need it, because he had been selling to your household for years, and the transaction required no documentation and no ceremony. He would slide the pack across the counter, take the money, make change, and send you on your way with the same unhurried ease he brought to every other sale of the morning. You might stop on the way home. Not to smoke necessarily, though some children did experiment, drawn by the same curiosity that makes anything adult feel like something worth trying. More often you would simply linger on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the weight of the errand in your hand, the cellophane-wrapped rectangle that was meant for someone else, before tucking it into your pocket and heading back up the front steps. Being trusted with the errand felt like something. It felt like being taken seriously, like being a useful part of the household in a concrete way that children understood and valued. The brands were part of the landscape of daily life in a way that is hard to fully convey now. Marlboro, Pall Mall, Salem, Winston, Lucky Strike. These were not abstract products. They were objects as familiar as the salt shaker on the kitchen table, or the soap by the bathroom sink, and a child running the errand would know which ones their parents smoked the way they knew which radio station their parent kept the dial on. The pack had a specific feel in the hand, and a specific sound when the cellophane was pulled, and a specific smell when the top was opened. And all of those details were simply part of the sensory texture of home. It is strange to hold that image now alongside what we know. The child returning with cigarettes was not being harmed by the errand in any way anyone in that household would have recognized. The parent was not negligent. The store owner was not reckless. Everyone was operating inside a set of norms so thoroughly established that no individual actor in the transaction had any particular reason to stop and question what they were participating in. The cigarettes would be smoked inside the house, in the car, at the dinner table, and the child would breathe that air and grow up inside it, and none of that would register as harm, because harm, to register, needs a frame of reference that did not yet exist. The child who ran that errand would grow up. They would become someone who would not dream of sending their own child to buy cigarettes, not because they made a deliberate choice to be different, but because the world they grew up to inhabit had changed around them, quietly and irreversibly, until the thing that once felt like nothing felt impossible instead. But on that particular afternoon, on a street that smelled of cut grass and exhaust and the warm asphalt of late summer, the errand was simple, the child was quick. The parent was waiting, and the pack landed on the kitchen table with a small familiar sound, and that was the whole of it. Walk into almost any enclosed public space in 1970s America, and the air would tell you immediately what decade you were in. Restaurants, bowling alleys, waiting rooms at the doctor's office, the break room at work, the back rows of movie theatres, the inside of taxi cabs, the cabin of a commercial airliner 30,000 feet in the air. Smoke was simply part of the atmosphere of indoor life. It drifted across dining tables and settled into hair and clothing and curtains and upholstery, and most people accepted it the way they accepted weather, as something that simply was, without origin or remedy. The restaurant is the easiest place to start because it captures the texture of the thing so completely. You would be seated, menus handed over, a glass of water placed in front of you, and within arm's reach there would be an ashtray, clean and waiting, as standard a piece of table setting as the salt and pepper. The couple at the next table might already be smoking, a thin pale column rising between the bread basket and the candle, the smell weaving through the aromas of whatever was cooking in the kitchen. This was not a smoking section. This was simply the restaurant. The division between smoking and non-smoking areas was a compromise that arrived only gradually, and even then it was more symbolic than functional, because air, as everyone eventually came to acknowledge, does not read the signs. Think about what that meant at the level of the body. Every meal eaten in a restaurant in those years included, as an involuntary side dish, the second-hand output of whatever the people around you were choosing to smoke. A family dinner, a first date, a business lunch, a birthday celebration. The smoke was there regardless of the occasion, and the people inside it were breathing it regardless of their preferences, and almost nobody in the room would have described this as a problem, because a problem requires contrast, and there was no version of a restaurant without smoke available to compare it to. The bowling alley had a quality all its own. The combination of cigarette smoke and lane oil, and the particular rubbery smell of rented shoes created something that anyone who spent time in a 1970s bowling alley would recognize instantly. It hung in the air above the lanes in a soft blue haze, thickening toward the ceiling under the fluorescent lights. Families bowled through it. Children ate hot dogs from the snack bar through it. The sound of pins scattering and the smell of smoke became so completely associated that for a certain generation they are essentially the same memory. At the doctor's office, the irony was simply not perceived as irony. Waiting rooms had ashtrays. Physicians smoked at their desks. Some lit a cigarette while reviewing a patient's chart and thought nothing of it, because the full weight of evidence linking smoking to the diseases they were treating was still in the process of becoming undeniable. The cigarette was a companion to concentration, a tool of the working day, as normal in a professional context as a cup of coffee or a mechanical pencil. On the airplane, the flight attendant moved through the cabin with the drink cart, and the ashtray built into the armrest of every seat was already in use before the plane reached cruising altitude. The recirculated air carried it from the smoking rows through the entire cabin, a physical fact that the designation of a non-smoking section could acknowledge but not alter. People arrived at their destinations smelling of the flight in a way that is no longer possible to experience, their clothes and hair saturated with the ambient air of a sealed metal tube at 30,000 feet. What is hard to convey is how invisible all of this was to the people inside it. Not invisible the way a secret is invisible, but invisible the way the ground under your feet is invisible. It was simply where life took place. The smell of other people's smoke was the smell of public space. And it was only when it began to disappear, restaurant by restaurant, workplace by workplace, flight by flight, that the generations who had grown up inside it began to understand what they had been breathing all along. The family car in the 1970s was a different kind of space than it is today. Children climbed into the back seat and immediately spread out across it, lying down, kneeling backward to look out the rear window, stretching across a sibling's lap, curling up on the parcel shelf beneath the rear glass to watch the sky roll by. Nobody buckled in. The seat belts, if the car had them, were usually tucked into the crack of the seat cushion, dusty from disuse. A long road trip felt like a rolling living room, loose and easy and completely unrestrained, and the idea that a sudden stop could send a child into the dashboard simply did not live in the front of anyone's mind. The cars themselves contributed to this feeling of expansive informality. The great American station wagons of the 1970s were rolling living rooms in the most literal sense. Wood-panelled on the sides, long and low, with bench seats wide enough to spread a blanket across and a rear cargo area where children rode facing backward through the rear window, watching the road unspool behind them. There was no seat back between those children and the glass. There was no harness. There was sometimes a sleeping bag, or a pile of road trip luggage, or a dog, and the children wove themselves around all of it, and watched the country go by and fell asleep against the window glass, and arrived at their destination without incident, because on most trips nothing happened, and nothing happening enough times produces a very specific and very dangerous kind of confidence. The physics of a car accident were not a topic that appeared in daily conversation. The mathematics of what happens to an unrestrained body when a vehicle stops suddenly, the forces involved, the fractions of a second in which a child travelling at highway speed covers the distance between the back seat and the windshield. None of this was part of the common understanding of driving. What was part of that understanding was the feel of the car, the sense of being settled and comfortable inside it, and the 1,000 uneventful journeys that made every subsequent journey feel equally safe. Mothers sometimes held infants in their laps in the front seat. This felt, in the moment, like the safest possible arrangement, because what could be more secure than being held? The answer, which crash testing would eventually make unavoidable, is almost anything, because a mother's grip is no match for the forces of a collision, and a child held in a lap becomes a projectile in any serious accident. But the logic of the hold felt sound. The warmth of it felt sound. The 100 drives that ended safely felt like evidence, and they were until they weren't. The seatbelt laws, when they began to arrive in the 1980s, met genuine resistance. People felt that the government was reaching into the private space of the family car and making decisions that belonged to individuals. The seatbelt was seen as uncomfortable, as restrictive, as evidence of a new and unwelcome tendency toward telling people how to manage their own risk. Some drivers cut the belts out of their cars entirely. Others simply continued to ignore them and paid the fine when cited. The habit of decades does not dissolve easily, and for many people who had grown up loose in the back seat, the idea that a strap across the chest was the difference between life and death still felt like an abstraction, even after the evidence was overwhelming. The children who rode unrestrained through the 1970s grew up and buckled their own children in from birth. The car seat installed before the baby came home from the hospital, the click of the harness as reflexive and non-negotiable as putting on shoes. Not because they thought about it, but because the world they grew up to inhabit had made it unthinkable to do otherwise. The change, once it came completely. And somewhere in that shift is the quiet story of how an entire culture's relationship with risk can transform in a single generation without anyone sitting down to formally decide that it should. Summer afternoons in a 1970s backyard had a particular quality of freedom and mild danger that is genuinely hard to reconstruct today. One of the most beloved expressions of that freedom came in the form of lawn darts, a game that sounds, in hindsight, almost deliberately hazardous. You took heavy metal-tipped projectiles the length of your forearm, you hurled them in a high arc through the open air, and the goal was to land them inside a plastic ring on the grass. Other people were somewhere in that same backyard. Children wandered in and out of the game zone. Nobody wore protective gear. And for years, this was simply what a good Saturday afternoon looked like. The darts themselves had a weight to them that you could feel from the first time you picked one up. Heavy at the tip, balanced along the length, with plastic fins at the back that caught the air and kept the trajectory honest. When you threw one correctly, there was a particular satisfaction to the arc of it. The way it rose and hung for a moment against a sky, the colour of old postcards before dropping with purpose toward the target ring below. A good throw made a sound when it hit the ground, a solid thud of metal finding earth, and that sound was its own reward. The target rings were simple, 2 plastic circles laid in the grass at a distance from each other, and the object was to get your dart inside the ring while keeping it out of reach for your opponent. It was a game that rewarded precision and a certain easy confidence in the throw, the kind of muscle knowledge that comes from a summer of afternoons, and the players who had spent the most time with their darts developed a fluency with them that made the whole enterprise look almost graceful. What the game required you not to think about, or rather what the culture of the time simply did not instruct you to think about, was the trajectory of a dart that missed. Because the dart did not stop being dangerous once it was in the air. It remained heavy and pointed and travelling at real speed, and a backyard in the middle of a summer afternoon in a residential neighbourhood was not a controlled environment. Younger siblings wandered, neighbours crossed through the yard, someone turned at the wrong moment. The reports of injuries accumulated slowly enough that each one felt like an anomaly, until the accumulation became impossible to dismiss, and by the late 1980s the game was banned entirely, removed from shelves in a way that felt abrupt only to those who had not been tracking the ledger. What replaced it was a version with soft-weighted tips, a blunt approximation of the original that kept the plastic rings and the basic structure of the game while removing the thing that made the original both thrilling and genuinely risky. Children today who play the sanitized version are playing something that references the original without fully inhabiting it, the way a photograph of a place references being there without delivering the actual light and air of it. For the people who played with the originals in the grass of a 1970s summer, the memory is specific and physical. The weight of the dart, the angle of the throw, the sound of the tip finding earth inside the ring, and the particular satisfaction of a game that asked something real of the body. The danger was not the point, but it was present, and its presence was part of what made the afternoon feel like something worth remembering. If you grew up in the early part of the 1970s and you were lucky enough to own a pair of clackers, you already know exactly what sound this segment is going to be about. Two hard acrylic balls connected by a string swung up and down with increasing speed until they collided above and below your hand with a crack loud enough to make a neighbour glance over the fence. The faster you could get them going, the more impressive the sound and the more status you had on the playground. What the toy's enthusiastic designers perhaps did not fully account for was what happened when one of those hard plastic balls shattered at speed, or when a child lost control and the whole spinning assembly found a face instead of the open air. Learning to use clackers was its own small education in persistence. The first attempts were clumsy, the balls swinging off rhythm, knocking against each other at odd angles, wrapping around the hand, catching knuckles with the casual cruelty of a toy still in the process of being understood. But once the rhythm came together, once you found the precise wrist motion that synchronized the swing and brought the balls clicking above and below in a steady mechanical pulse, something clicked in your understanding of the thing as well. You were doing it. The sound was clean and fast and undeniable, and everybody nearby knew it. That sound carried across playgrounds in a way that drew attention. Other children would drift over to watch and then to try, and the clackers would pass from hand to hand along with the accumulated wisdom of how to hold them and how to start and how to build speed without losing control. Expertise was demonstrated. Status was real. The child who could clack fastest and longest held a particular kind of playground authority that required no words to establish. What the faster pace also introduced was instability. The acrylic that the balls were made from was hard and rigid, and at high speed the collisions were significant. Some balls developed hairline cracks from repeated impact. Some shattered without warning, sending fragments in directions the child holding them had no ability to predict or protect against. The eye injuries were severe enough that schools began banning them, which in the way of all forbidden things made them more desirable on the days they were smuggled onto school grounds, tucked into jacket pockets and produced at recess like contraband. The redesigned version, with softer materials and less violent impact, arrived eventually and addressed the literal shrapnel problem while leaving behind something harder to name. The new clackers did not sound the same. They didn't feel the same in the hand. The crack of hard acrylic at speed was specific and irreplaceable, and children who had experienced it were not easily fooled by the gentler substitute. The original had a quality of genuine consequence to it, a realness that the redesign, for all its safety improvements, could not replicate. For those who remember them, clackers occupy a particular drawer in the cabinet of childhood memory, alongside other experiences that required something real from the body. They were loud, and they were physical, and they were occasionally dangerous, and they were entirely, completely, unavoidably fun. For a stretch of the 1970s, depending on which state you happened to live in, an 18-year-old could walk into a bar on a Friday night and order a beer without anyone blinking. This was legal, widely accepted, and felt to most people at the time like simple fairness. If a young man was old enough to be drafted into military service and sent overseas, the argument went, surely he was old enough to have a drink. Many states agreed and lowered their drinking ages to reflect that logic. For a few years, a significant portion of American teenagers navigated adulthood with access to alcohol that their counterparts today would find astonishing, and the consequences of that access slowly began to reveal themselves on the nation's roads. The bars themselves were different places in those years, or perhaps more accurately, they were the same places that bars have always been, but populated by people who now included the recently graduated senior class, alongside the working adults and the veterans and the regulars who had been drinking in the same spot for a decade. A Friday night in a bar in a state where 18 was the legal age had a particular energy to it. Youth was visibly present in a way that felt, depending on your perspective, either democratic or destabilizing. The conversations at adjacent tables covered the entire range of what young adulthood contains: first jobs and uncertain futures, and the particular confident ignorance of people old enough to order a drink and too young to fully understand what the night might hold once the drinks were finished. The drive home was the part that gathered no scrutiny. This was perhaps the most consequential feature of the era's relationship with alcohol and young people. Not simply that teenagers could drink legally, but that they drove home afterward through the same roads their parents used, with the same near-total absence of enforcement that characterized drunk driving broadly in the 1970s. The police in many jurisdictions were more likely to follow an impaired driver to make sure they arrived safely than to cite them for the impairment itself. The social contract around drinking and driving operated on a set of assumptions that the accident statistics were quietly disproving, year by year, mile by mile. The numbers that eventually became undeniable involved young drivers disproportionately. Fatal accidents, teenagers and young adults overrepresented in the data in a way that could not be explained away as coincidence or attributed to driving experience alone. The access to alcohol was a variable, and when researchers began analysing it that way, the case for raising the drinking age back to 21 started to build. The movement that made it happen included grieving parents who had lost children to drunk drivers and who found in each other the basis for an organisation that would eventually change federal policy. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act, passed in 1984, applied pressure through highway funding, and states complied one by one until the map was uniform. The 18-year-olds who had legally ordered beer in 1975 became the parents of children who would not be able to do the same until they were 21. The change felt to some of the people it affected like a thing taken away. To others it felt like an acknowledgement of something the roads had been trying to say for years. It is almost impossible to picture now, but in many American high schools during the 1970s, there was a designated outdoor area where students were permitted to smoke between classes. It was usually a specific courtyard, or a section of the parking lot, or a sheltered corner near the gymnasium, and during the few minutes between periods, students would drift toward it with the ease of a long-established habit. Teachers smoked in the faculty lounge. Administrators smoked in their offices. The school nurse sometimes smoked at her desk. Smoking was so completely woven into the fabric of adult life that trying to prevent teenagers from participating simply seemed like a losing battle, and many schools chose to manage it instead. The smoking area had its own social architecture, as all designated spaces in schools inevitably do. It was not simply a place to smoke, it was a place to be. The students who gathered there during the between-class minutes had a particular relationship with the school's social geography, an ease with the edges of things, a comfort with being slightly outside the main current of the building's official life. Conversations happened there that did not happen in the cafeteria. Friendships were maintained across grade levels in ways that the classroom structure did not naturally encourage. The cigarette was the nominal reason for being there, but presence in the space meant something independent of what you were or were not actually smoking. The teachers who smoked did so with a casualness that made it simply part of the visual texture of the school day. A history teacher who smoked at the corner of his desk during a free period, the cigarette resting in a glass ashtray beside the stack of papers he was grading, was not a figure of scandal or concern. He was simply a teacher with a habit, and the habit was his own, and it took place inside the building where students spent their days without anyone formally questioning what it meant that the person responsible for their education was demonstrating the habit within their direct line of sight. The contradiction embedded in all of this, which the era was not particularly interested in examining, was that the school as an institution was simultaneously transmitting health information in science classes and implicitly normalizing smoking through the behavior of its own staff and the accommodation of its student smokers. A student might learn in a biology class about the effects of smoking on the lungs and then walk out to find 3 of their teachers lighting up in the parking lot. The information and the example were in direct conflict, and the example, as examples tend to do, carried more weight. The designated areas disappeared gradually as the evidence around second-hand smoke hardened into policy, and the cultural consensus around smoking in public shifted beneath everyone's feet. Schools that had managed the smoking area as a pragmatic solution to an established habit found themselves in a new landscape, where the pragmatism looked, from the outside, like complicity. The areas were closed, the signs came down, and the courtyard or parking lot corner that had gathered students between classes for years was reclaimed for something else, leaving only the memory of smoke and the particular light of a winter morning, and the conversations that took place there before anyone decided they shouldn't. Turn on the television in the early part of the 1970s, and before the ban took full effect, you might still catch the tail end of a world where cigarette commercials were as common as soap ads. A rugged man on horseback, a woman in a white linen dress laughing in a sunlit field, a catchy slogan that rhymed, that stuck in your head, that made smoking feel like the natural companion to leisure, to sophistication, to a certain uncomplicated American ease. The tobacco companies had spent decades perfecting the art of making a product that shortened lives feel like something that enhanced them, and by the time television pulled the plug, they had already built a mythology powerful enough to outlast the ban by a generation. The television commercial was the peak form of that mythology, a 30-second distillation of everything the tobacco industry wanted you to feel when you thought about cigarettes: freedom, confidence, romance. The open American landscape stretched behind a man who looked like he had never sat behind a desk in his life. A couple leaning toward each other across a candlelit table, the cigarette a prop in a scene that was really about desire. A doctor, sometimes, or someone in a white coat who lent the product the borrowed authority of medicine. The craft that went into these images was real, and its effect on public perception was enormous and lasting. Children watched these commercials alongside their parents. Saturday morning cartoons gave way to afternoon programming that carried the full range of tobacco advertising between segments, and the brand names and the slogans and the images accumulated in young minds alongside everything else the television delivered. By the time those children were old enough to make their own choices about smoking, the brands were as familiar as the faces of their favourite actors and the names of their favourite songs. The advertising had arrived before the choice and shaped the landscape in which the choice would eventually be made. The ban took effect in January of 1971, and what happened immediately after it is one of the more instructive stories in the history of marketing. The tobacco companies took the money they had been spending on television and radio and directed it into magazines, billboards, sports sponsorships, and eventually into the placement of their products in films. The Marlboro Man did not retire. He simply relocated, appearing on roadside billboards large enough to be seen from a moving car at highway speed, on the back covers of magazines left in waiting rooms and barbershops and libraries. The imagery was the same. The mythology was the same. Only the screen had changed. What the ban did do, over time, was alter the ambient presence of cigarette advertising in spaces that children reliably occupied. The living room television, which families gathered around, was no longer a delivery mechanism for tobacco mythology in the same way. The change was partial and imperfect, and the industry adapted to it with considerable skill. But the absence of that specific daily exposure, the commercial break, the catchy jingle, the aspirational image arriving between sitcom segments, was real, and its effects on subsequent generations were real as well, accumulating slowly in the space between what was advertised and what was eventually chosen. If you were a child in the 1970s, there is a very good chance that the pajamas you wore to bed were treated with a chemical flame retardant called TRIS, and there is an equally good chance that nobody in your household knew what that meant or thought to ask. Fire safety was a genuine concern in an era of open-flame gas stoves and cigarettes dropped on upholstered furniture, and the decision to treat children's sleepwear with flame-resistant chemicals seemed, on the surface, like straightforward protection. The fabric was soft. The pajamas were cheerful, printed with cartoon characters or little rocket ships, and they were quietly soaking through children's skin night after night with something that researchers would eventually connect to serious health consequences. The pajamas sat in drawers and on bedroom floors and in the laundry baskets of ordinary households, indistinguishable in feel and appearance from any other sleepwear. They were folded by mothers and pulled on by children at bedtime and worn through the night and washed and worn again in the ordinary rotation of a family's domestic life. The chemical treatment was not visible. It had no smell. It left no residue that anyone could identify with the senses available to a parent tucking a child into bed. It was simply present, engineered into the fabric at a manufacturing level, absorbed through skin contact across the hours of sleep, night after night, across childhood. The concern that eventually emerged around TRIS followed a pattern that had become familiar by the 1970s, the slow accumulation of evidence from researchers who were not immediately believed, followed by a lag during which the product continued to be sold and used, followed by a regulatory response that arrived after the exposure had already taken place across years of ordinary life. The chemical was linked to potential carcinogenic effects, and in 1977 the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned its use in children's sleepwear. The ban was real, and the response was relatively swift once the evidence hardened. But the years before the ban had already happened, and the children who had worn those pajamas through them carried whatever they carried. What followed the ban was a practical problem for manufacturers who had built their compliance with fire safety requirements around the chemical treatment. The solution for many was a shift toward tighter-fitting sleepwear made from less flammable natural fibres, the logic being that a garment with less loose fabric held against the skin presented a different fire risk profile than the loose, treated cotton of the earlier era. Parents who had bought their children's pajamas based on cheerful prints and soft fabric now navigated a landscape that had quietly changed beneath them, the tags and packaging reflecting new requirements that most of them encountered without fully understanding what had necessitated them. The furniture did not change as quickly as the sleepwear. The flame retardants used in upholstered sofas and chairs and mattresses continued for decades past the sleepwear ban, accumulating in the dust of homes and in the bodies of the people living in them, the evidence connecting them to hormone disruption and other health effects building gradually in the scientific literature, while the furniture sat in living rooms and bedrooms, absorbing the daily life of families who had no particular reason to think about the foam inside the cushions they were sitting on. The full reckoning with that chapter is still ongoing in ways that the 1970s could not have anticipated. But on a Tuesday evening in 1973, a child was put to bed in rocket ship pyjamas, and the room smelled of soap and the particular warmth of a small body recently bathed, and the parent leaning down to say goodnight was thinking about tomorrow and not about chemistry, and the night was quiet and everything felt exactly as safe as it always had. Walk into almost any American home built before the late 1970s, and somewhere beneath the current layers of paint, on the walls, on the windowsills, on the wooden railings of a porch, there is a layer that contains lead. In the 1970s, this was simply the paint that had been used for decades, bright and durable and long-lasting, the kind that held its colour through summer heat and winter damp, and the accumulated fingerprints of a family living their ordinary life. Children ran their hands along those walls, toddlers chewed on windowsills, paint chips fell to the floor and were swept up without a second thought. And the damage, silent and slow and invisible, was accumulating. The paint had qualities that made it genuinely desirable in ways that had nothing to do with its hidden contents. It covered well, it dried hard, it resisted moisture and scuffing and the particular abuse that a wall receives at the height of a child's hand over years of daily life. The colours held their brightness in a way that cheaper formulations could not quite match, and the surface it produced had a solidity to it, a sense of permanence that felt appropriate to the serious business of making a home. The people who chose it were choosing quality. They were painting the rooms where their families would live and the porches where their children would play, and they were making a reasonable decision with the information available to them. The windowsills were the particular point of concern that researchers kept returning to, and for a reason that anyone who has spent time around small children would understand immediately. A windowsill at toddler height is exactly the kind of surface a small hand reaches for, runs along, grips for balance, and as lead paint ages, as it dries and shrinks and the wood beneath it expands and contracts through seasons, it develops a tendency to flake. The chips are small. Sometimes they are sweet, a quality of lead compounds that was known long before the full picture of lead toxicity was understood, and that made the exposure particularly difficult to prevent in households with very young children. A chip would fall, a child would find it, and the exchange would happen in a second, silently, while a parent was in the next room. The dust was the other vector, and in some ways the more insidious one. When lead paint is disturbed, when a window is opened and closed repeatedly against its painted frame, when a door scrapes its painted jamb, when a renovation project sends a contractor through a wall with a power tool, the paint does not simply flake. It generates dust, fine enough to be invisible, light enough to hang in the air, small enough to be inhaled without sensation. The families living in homes where renovation work was underway were often breathing lead dust without knowing it. The air of their home temporarily transformed by a project intended to improve it into something considerably more hazardous than what it had been before. The federal ban on lead paint for residential use arrived in 1978, which felt to the people who'd been pushing for it like a long overdue acknowledgement, and to most homeowners like a change in a product category they had not been thinking very hard about. The paint disappeared from store shelves, manufacturers reformulated, and the houses that had already been painted, which was to say nearly every house in America built before that year, remained exactly as they were. The ban addressed future exposure. What we now understand about lead's effect on the developing brain is specific enough to be haunting when placed against the ordinariness of those years. The neurological impact does not announce itself. It does not produce a visible symptom at the moment of exposure. It works over time, subtly altering the architecture of a developing mind in ways that may express themselves as difficulties with attention, with impulse control, with a particular kind of sustained concentration that school and later working life require. The children affected would not have known what was shaping them. Their parents would not have known. The houses simply stood, as houses do, holding the lives inside them and the history within their walls. There is something worth sitting within that. The way so much of what shaped a generation was built into the surfaces of the spaces where they grew up, ordinary and unexamined and completely taken for granted. The walls were painted, the rooms were warm. The family was home, and beneath the colour someone had chosen with care was something nobody had asked to be there, patient and invisible, as permanent in its own way as the house itself. The family road trip of the 1970s had a looseness to it that is genuinely difficult to imagine today. Children rode in the back with no restraint system worth the name. Infants were sometimes held in a parent's lap in the front seat, the parent's arm thrown across them at a stop as though human reflexes were a reasonable substitute for physics. If a car seat existed at all, it was likely a flimsy plastic booster designed to help a small child see out the window, with no crash testing behind it, and no engineering beyond the basic concept of height. It was a time when the danger of the family car to its smallest passengers was not yet something that lived in daily awareness, and the roads held consequences that nobody had yet found the language to prevent. The car was a domestic space in a way that it perhaps no longer is. Long drives were not segmented by the entertainment requirements of restrained children who needed screens and snacks delivered to fixed positions. Children moved. They arranged themselves in configurations that shifted over the miles, one leaning against a window, another stretched across a sibling, a third on the floor between the seats playing with something small and portable. The back seat of a family station wagon on a summer drive was a kind of improvised world, self-organizing and loose, governed by the particular social dynamics of the children inside it, rather than the engineering of the vehicle around them. The booster seats that did exist in those years were largely designed around visibility rather than safety. The logic was practical and not unreasonable on its face. A small child sitting on a standard seat could not see out the window, could not see where the family was going, and was uncomfortable in a way that made long drives difficult for everyone. The booster addressed this. It raised the child. It gave them a view and a more comfortable position. What it did not do, and was not designed to do, was protect them in any meaningful way from the forces generated by a collision. It was a comfort device wearing the rough shape of a safety device, and the distinction mattered enormously in the moments that tested it. Infants travelled in the arms of whoever was holding them, or in wicker baskets placed on the back seat, or in small fabric carriers that attached to the seat without any engineering standard behind them. The tenderness with which a parent held an infant on a car journey was real and genuine and completely irrelevant to the physics of what happened when a car stopped suddenly. The grip that felt secure at rest became nothing in the fraction of a second that determined outcomes in a serious accident. Parents who had held their children safely through hundreds of uneventful trips had no reason to doubt the method, and the trips continued. Tennessee became the first state to pass a child passenger protection law in 1977, requiring young children to be restrained in approved safety seats. Other states followed slowly through the early 1980s. The laws met the same resistance that seatbelt laws met more broadly, a sense that the government had inserted itself into a private family decision, combined with the practical reality that the approved car seats were expensive and unfamiliar, and required a degree of installation effort that felt disproportionate to a risk that still felt theoretical to most parents. What shifted the conversation most powerfully was not legislation but data, the specific and unavoidable accounting of what happened to unrestrained children in accidents versus what happened to restrained ones. The numbers were not subtle. They described a difference between outcomes that no parent, confronted with them directly, could easily dismiss. The car seat moved from optional accessory to moral obligation in the space of roughly a decade, and by the time the children of the 1970s were having children of their own, the installation of the car seat before the drive home from the hospital was as non-negotiable as any other preparation for a new life. The back seat is a quieter place now in some ways, with children buckled into fixed positions and the loose domestic improvisation of the old road trip replaced by a more structured arrangement. Something was gained that cannot be calculated in anything but the most important terms, and something that was simply the texture of how childhood felt in a moving car, that rolling looseness, that spreading out and settling in, belongs now to a specific time and a specific way of travelling through the country that no longer exists. There are things about the 1970s that feel merely quaint from a distance, and then there are things that feel genuinely chilling once you understand what they meant in practice. The culture around drinking and driving belonged firmly in that second category. A night out at the bar ended with people climbing behind the wheel without a serious second thought. Law enforcement in many areas took a relaxed approach, sometimes stopping a visibly impaired driver only to suggest they take the back roads home. The legal blood alcohol limits in most states were significantly higher than today's standard, and the social stigma that now surrounds drunk driving had not yet formed. What existed instead was a widespread belief that most people could handle it, a belief the highways quietly disproved every single week. The end of an evening in those years had a particular sequence that was so common it barely registered as a decision at all. Dinner at a restaurant, a few drinks, perhaps more than a few, a prolonged goodbye in the parking lot, and then the drive home. The car keys were in your pocket and the car was in the lot, and the house was 20 minutes away, and you had made this same drive 100 times and you were fine. You were always fine, and the roads at this hour were mostly empty anyway. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing, built from the accumulated evidence of all the nights that had ended without incident, and it felt, in the moment, like reasonable assessment rather than rationalization. The social dimension of drinking and driving in the 1970s extended into professional life in ways that feel remarkable today. Office parties ended with employees driving home after an open bar. Business lunches included multiple rounds with no expectation that the afternoon drive back to the office would be anything other than routine. Holiday gatherings were understood to involve drinking and also to involve driving, and the tension between those two facts was not widely acknowledged as tension. You drank, you drove, you arrived, and on the nights you did not arrive, the cause was more likely to be described as an accident than as a predictable consequence of a known behaviour. The enforcement landscape contributed meaningfully to the culture. A police officer in most jurisdictions had considerable discretion in how to handle a driver who appeared impaired, and the discretion was frequently exercised in the direction of leniency. A verbal warning, a suggestion to get some coffee, an offer to follow the driver to the edge of town. These responses were not understood as failures of enforcement but as reasonable, human applications of judgment, the officer deciding that the paperwork and the processing were not proportionate to the situation in front of them. The accumulation of those individual decisions, repeated thousands of times a night across the country, produced a roads environment in which the consequences of impaired driving were distributed unevenly and largely invisibly. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was founded in 1980 by Candace Lightner after her daughter was killed by a repeat drunk driving offender, and the organisation she built became one of the most effective advocacy groups in American history, not because it introduced a new argument, but because it put human faces on a problem that had been allowed to remain statistical. The deaths had always been happening. The data had always existed. What changed was the frame around them, and the frame changed because people who had lost someone refused to accept the language of accident and began insisting on the language of cause and consequence. The legal changes that followed came in stages, the limits lowered, the enforcement strengthened, the penalties increased, the cultural conversation shifted until the casual confidence of a 1970s parking lot became something genuinely unthinkable. The roads are not safe now in any absolute sense, but they are different, measurably and significantly different, and the difference traces back to a change in how a society decided to talk about something it had long been willing to look past. Walk into the right kind of pet store in the 1970s, and you might find things that would trigger an immediate phone call to wildlife authorities today. Monkeys in small cages, young boa constrictors draped over a heat lamp, macaws and cockatoos from distant rainforests, legally imported, legally sold, legally taken home by anyone with the money and the enthusiasm. The regulatory framework around exotic animals was thin to the point of transparency, and the consequences of that thinness played out in suburban backyards and apartment living rooms across the country. Animals that belonged in jungles and grasslands ended up in houses in Ohio and New Jersey, and when they grew too large or too difficult, the solutions were rarely straightforward. The appeal of the exotic pet was not difficult to understand. There was something genuinely extraordinary about the idea of bringing a piece of the wider world into an ordinary domestic setting, a creature from a place most people would never visit, living in the spare bedroom or the backyard enclosure, a daily reminder that the planet contained more than the subdivision and the commute. The people who pursued these animals were not, for the most part, reckless or thoughtless. They were enthusiastic in the way that collectors and hobbyists are enthusiastic, absorbed by a specific passion and operating within the rules as they existed. The monkey was perhaps the most emblematic of the era's exotic pet culture, small enough to be carried, expressive enough to seem almost communicative, visually striking in a way that generated conversation and attention wherever it appeared. People who kept monkeys talked about them with the same devotion that other pet owners brought to dogs and cats. They named them, dressed them occasionally, brought them on errands. The fact that a monkey is a wild animal with the strength and instincts of a wild animal, and that those qualities do not disappear in a domestic setting, but only become more dangerous as the animal matures, was not something the retail transaction at the pet store was designed to communicate. The snakes grew. The birds developed their full adult vocalizations, loud enough to be audible from the street, in several cases loud enough to prompt complaints from neighbors a block away. The primates reached sexual maturity, and the behavioral changes that accompanied it were not compatible with a household not equipped to manage them. The animals that had been charming and manageable as juveniles became problems that required solutions their owners had not anticipated and were often not equipped to provide. Zoos declined, most of them. Sanctuaries had waiting lists. The options narrowed in ways that were difficult for everyone involved, most of all for the animals, who'd been transported across continents to inhabit spaces that could not meet their needs regardless of the owner's intentions. The regulatory changes that came through the 1980s and 1990s addressed the trade in stages, requiring permits, restricting species, tightening the import rules that had made the original transactions possible. The pet stores that had stocked monkeys and constrictors shifted their inventories toward animals the new rules permitted. The era of the casual exotic pet closed without a formal announcement, replaced by a landscape of paperwork and permitting that made the acquisition of a wild animal a deliberate and documented process rather than a Saturday afternoon purchase. What remained in the aftermath was a population of animals in private hands that existing regulations struggled to account for, and a set of memories, held by the people who had kept them, of a relationship between humans and wild creatures that the distance of years has made harder to evaluate simply. The animals were real. The attachment was real. The inadequacy of the arrangement was also real, and the reckoning with that inadequacy is still ongoing in ways the 1970s pet store could not have foreseen. There is a particular kind of childhood daring that used to attach itself to railroad tracks, and in the 1970s it was widespread enough to be almost universal in towns and small cities across America. Kids walked the rails like tightropes, arms out for balance, placing one foot precisely in front of the other on the warm steel. They laid pennies on the tracks and waited in the tall grass nearby for a freight train to flatten them into something thin and oval and strange. They took shortcuts through rail yards without a second thought, treating the infrastructure of heavy industry as an extension of the neighbourhood. The tracks were there, the trains came in frequently enough to feel theoretical, and nobody had yet erected the fences or the warning signs that line those same corridors today. The rails themselves had a particular quality in summer, warm from the sun in a way that was different from the warmth of pavement or dirt. A stored heat that came up through the soles of your shoes and made the steel feel almost alive. Walking the rail required a specific kind of attention, the arms adjusting constantly, the eyes fixed on the line ahead rather than the ground immediately below, the whole body engaged in the small continuous project of not falling. Children who spent time on the rails developed a fluency with that balance that felt like a private skill, something earned through practice rather than taught, a knowledge the body held. The penny flattening was its own ritual with its own patience. You selected the penny carefully sometimes, examining it for a date worth preserving in its new form, or simply choosing the most worn one from your pocket, because it no longer had much to lose. You placed it on the rail with a precision that the act did not technically require, but that felt appropriate to the solemnity of what was about to happen. And then you retreated to the grass and you waited, the air smelling of warm metal and creosote from the treated ties, until the vibration came up through the ground before the sound did, and then the sound, and then the train itself, enormous and fast and completely indifferent to the small ceremony you had arranged around its passage. The penny emerged from the other side of the event flattened and warm, its surface transformed into something smooth and featureless and faintly oval. The Queen's profile or Lincoln's face pressed into pure anonymity by tons of moving steel. You picked it up carefully because it held heat the way the rail did, and you turned it over in your fingers and felt the smoothness of it, and you put it in your pocket, and it became an artifact of the afternoon, evidence of something you had done that most adults would not have approved. The rail yard was another kind of territory altogether, larger and more serious, a landscape of intersecting tracks and parked freight cars, and the particular industrial silence of machinery at rest. Children who ventured into rail yards were trespassing in a technical sense that nobody in the neighbourhood seemed to consider very seriously. The cars provided cover, and the tracks provided a maze, and the whole space had an abandoned world quality that made it irresistible to children who were drawn to places that felt genuinely outside the ordinary supervision of adults. What has changed is not the tracks, which still run through the same corridors they always did, but the relationship between those corridors and the neighbourhoods around them. The fences are higher, the signage is more aggressive, the trains are faster and quieter than the freight trains of the 1970s, which announced themselves with enough sound and vibration to give a child standing on the tracks a reasonable chance of getting clear. Modern trains arrive with less warning than the era that made rail walking seem survivable, and the organisations that now work on railway safety understand that the casualness of the past was not a measure of actual safety, but of luck distributed unevenly across a generation of children who never fully understood what they were standing on. The story of Red Dye No. 2 is one of those peculiar corners of 1970s food history, where public fear, corporate caution, and the limits of scientific certainty all collided in a way that produced an outcome nobody had quite predicted. The dye was widely used in processed foods, candy and beverages, and when studies suggested a possible link to health risks, the anxiety that followed moved faster than the evidence could keep up with. Companies pulled products, consumers avoided anything red, and in one of the stranger footnotes of the era, a famous candy manufacturer removed red candies from their product entirely, not because they used the dye in question, but because the climate of fear made the colour itself feel like a liability. The dye had been part of the American food supply for long enough that its presence in everything from maraschino cherries to gelatin desserts to the frosting on a birthday cake felt as natural as salt. It was one of the colour additives that made processed food look the way processed food was supposed to look, vivid and appetizing and consistent in a way that the natural variation of actual ingredients could not reliably produce. Red was a colour that signalled ripeness, sweetness, flavour, and the food industry had learned to deploy it with considerable skill in products that contained none of the things red naturally indicated. The study that precipitated the crisis involved laboratory rats fed cyclamate and red dye number 2 in quantities that no human would consume in anything approaching normal circumstances. The methodology was contested almost immediately by scientists who pointed out the dose problem and the difficulties of extrapolating from rodent studies to human risk. But the headlines did not carry the methodological nuance. They carried the finding, simplified and alarming, and the finding was enough to shift consumer behaviour in ways that the follow-up studies and the expert qualifications could not easily undo. The grocery store in 1976 became a place where the colour red on a package required a moment of hesitation that it had not required the week before. People read labels in a new way, looking for an ingredient name they had not previously known to look for, and finding it in enough places to generate a low-level ongoing anxiety about the contents of the foods they were already eating. The anxiety was not easily resolvable, because the information was genuinely uncertain, and the official guidance was not consistently reassuring, and in that space of uncertainty people made their own individual calculations about what felt acceptable. The candy manufacturer's decision to remove red from its product was driven by a logic that had less to do with its own actual ingredients than with the optics of colour in a moment when colour had become controversial. The red candies came out of the bags and stayed out for more than a decade, replaced by additional quantities of the other colours, and the bag sold and the candy was eaten, and most consumers adapted to the absence without much complaint, and some did not notice it at all. When the red candies returned in the late 1980s, they came back into a market that had largely moved past the original alarm, accepted back into the colour rotation, with the quiet normalcy that follows the resolution of a controversy that was never entirely resolved. What the episode illustrates, beyond the specific chemistry and the specific corporate decisions, is the way that public perception of food safety operates according to its own logic, one that responds to headlines and images and the emotional weight of words like cancer in ways that do not map neatly onto the actual structure of the evidence. The fear ran ahead of the facts, and the facts, when they arrived more fully formed, could not entirely recall the fear. The red candies came back, but the episode left a faint residue in the collective memory of American consumers, a reminder that the contents of an ordinary package of candy were not as simple or as settled as they had always appeared. In the 1970s, in enough parts of rural and small-town America to make it feel entirely commonplace, you could drive out to a farm and come home with a jar of milk that had never been pasteurized. It was thick and cold and tasted of the specific grass the cow had been eating, and people who preferred it talked about it the way people now talk about farmers' market produce, as something closer to real, something the industrial food system had processed the soul out of. The risks that came with it, the bacteria that pasteurization exists specifically to eliminate, were not widely understood or widely discussed. What was understood was the taste, and the familiarity and the quiet pleasure of a transaction conducted between neighbours. The farm itself was a place you might know in the particular way that rural communities know their productive neighbours, not as strangers behind a counter, but as people whose land you had driven past for years, whose family name was on the mailbox at the end of the gravel road, whose operation you understood in the broad outlines because it was simply part of the landscape of the place you lived. You might knock at the kitchen door rather than approach anything resembling a storefront. The transaction might involve conversation about the weather and the herd and the quality of the summer before you came away with what you came for, and that conversation was part of what made the milk feel like something different from the paper carton in the supermarket cooler. The taste was genuinely distinct, and not in a way that required a particularly refined palate to perceive. Fresh raw milk from a healthy cow on good pasture has a richness and a depth that the homogenization process alters, not dramatically, but perceptibly, in the way that any process applied to a natural product leaves a trace of itself in the result. The cream did not stay integrated. It rose to the top of the jar overnight, a thick layer that could be skimmed off and used separately or shaken back in, and the act of shaking it, of reincorporating the cream before pouring, was itself a small daily ritual that connected the person using it to the basic facts of what milk actually was before the industrial supply chain smoothed those facts away. The bacteria that pasteurization eliminates are real, and their effects on human health are serious. Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli. These are not theoretical threats invented by regulators to justify process requirements, but organisms that cause genuine illness and that have killed people in outbreaks linked to unpasteurized dairy products. The cases were less visible in the 1970s not because they were not happening, but because the surveillance systems that would later connect scattered individual illnesses to a common source were not yet as developed, and because the cultural acceptance of some baseline level of foodborne illness was higher in an era before the full framework of modern food safety had been assembled. The federal mandate for pasteurization of interstate milk sales arrived in 1987, and states moved at varying speeds toward their own versions of the regulation. The map of where raw milk is legal today is a patchwork of state laws that reflects the ongoing tension between food safety requirements and the preferences of consumers who have decided that the risk is acceptable and the benefit is real. In some states it is sold in stores. In others it is available only at the farm where it is produced. In others it is not available legally at all, and people who want it find other arrangements. The jar of milk brought home from the farm in the 1970s exists now as a memory with a complicated texture. The taste was what the people who sought it said it was. The pleasure of the transaction was real, and the risk, which felt abstract on a summer morning standing in a farmyard with the smell of hay and the sound of cattle nearby, was also real, distributed unevenly and invisibly across the people who took it, most of whom came to no harm, and some of whom did. Every corner store in 1970s, America had them somewhere near the register, usually tucked in among the wax lips and the candy necklaces and the little wax bottles filled with coloured syrup. Candy cigarettes, wrapped in paper, tipped with a dusting of red sugar at one end, sold in a little box designed to look exactly like the real thing. Children bought them with their allowance money and slid them between their fingers the way they had seen adults do, raising them to their lips, blowing a little puff of powdered sugar smoke into the air. Nobody thought of it as practicing. It was just candy. The whole cultural saturation of smoking was so complete that a confection modelled on cigarettes felt no more remarkable than a toy telephone. The corner store itself was a particular institution in those years, smaller than a convenience store in the modern sense and embedded in the neighbourhood in a way that the chain-operated gas station convenience stores that eventually replaced many of them were not. The person behind the counter was often the owner, and the owner often knew the children who came in, knew their parents, knew the general shape of their allowances and their preferences. The candy display near the register was a carefully curated landscape of small pleasures within a child's financial reach, and the candy cigarettes occupied their place within it without distinction or controversy, as natural a part of the inventory as the bubble gum and the licorice ropes. The box was part of the experience. Designed to replicate the look of an actual cigarette pack, it opened with the same kind of flip top, and the candy sticks inside were arranged in the same parallel rows, white and uniform, with the red-tipped end visible when you looked down at them. A child carrying a box of candy cigarettes was performing, in miniature, the same relationship to the object that an adult carrying a pack of real cigarettes was performing. The case held in a certain way, the individual stick extracted with a deliberate gesture, the whole routine absorbed from years of watching the adults in their lives treat the real version with the same unconscious ceremony. The puff of powdered sugar that some varieties produced when you blew on them was the detail that made the mimicry most complete. It was smoke, in the logic of the game, and the logic of the game was simply the logic of the world as children in the 1970s understood it. Grown-ups smoked. Grown-ups were the people you were in the process of becoming. Practicing the gestures of adult life was what play was partly for, and the candy cigarette provided a specific and socially legible prop for that practice, in the same way that toy kitchens and toy tool sets provided props for practicing other aspects of what adult life appeared to involve. The argument that eventually built against candy cigarettes, and that led to packaging changes and restrictions in various markets, centered on the normalization concern. The idea that familiarizing children with the shape and ritual of smoking before they were old enough to make informed choices about it was not a neutral act. The candy itself was harmless. The sugar was the sugar in any other confection. What was being transmitted was something more than sweetness, a relationship to an object and a gesture and a habit, delivered through play in the years when habits of mind are most easily established. The candy cigarettes that remain available today are sold under different names and come in packaging that has been deliberately distanced from the original cigarette box design. The candy stick without the cigarette branding is a different object in important ways, the same sugar in a different frame, and the frame, it turned out, was the part that mattered. For the children who bought the original version at the corner store in 1973, the memory lives in the specific weight of the box and the particular taste of the sugar and the powdered cloud, exhaled toward a summer sky, innocent and elaborate and entirely of its time. Before saccharin, before aspartame, before the long alphabetical list of artificial sweeteners that now populate the back of every diet beverage label, there was cyclamate, and for a time in the 1960s and into the early 70s it was everywhere. It was 30 times sweeter than sugar, calorie-free, and considered a genuine breakthrough for anyone trying to enjoy something sweet without the consequences. It sweetened diet sodas and sugar-free candies and processed foods across the country, and then a study came along that gave laboratory rats bladder tumours at very high doses, and the trajectory changed almost overnight. The ban that followed left a gap in the American pantry that other sweeteners rushed to fill, and cyclamate became a ghost flavour, legal in much of the world but absent from American shelves ever since. The diet soda of the early 1970s had a taste that was specific to cyclamate, in ways that people who drank it regularly could identify, a sweetness that was clean and somewhat cool on the tongue, different in character from the sweetness of sugar and different again from the sweetness that saccharin and its successors would produce. The people who drank Tab and similar beverages in those years developed a palate for that particular sweetness, in the way that regular consumers of any product develop a preference, not through deliberate connoisseurship but through repetition and familiarity and the small daily pleasure of a taste that matched expectation. The study that ended cyclamate in the American market was conducted at doses that the scientific community debated almost immediately. The rats that developed tumours had consumed quantities of the sweetener that no human being following a normal diet would approach, and the extrapolation from those results to human risk was contested by researchers who understood the dose-response relationship well enough to be sceptical of the headline version of the findings. But the regulatory framework that existed in 1969 operated on principles of caution that the contested evidence was enough to trigger, and the ban came through before the scientific argument had reached anything like resolution. What happened next in the American sweetener market is its own study in how a consumer category responds to the sudden removal of a dominant ingredient. Saccharin moved into the space cyclamate had occupied, with its own distinct flavour profile and its own eventual controversy, its own rat studies and its own round of public alarm and its own partial regulatory response. The diet soda drinker of the 1970s navigated a landscape of artificial sweeteners that were each, in turn, introduced with confidence and questioned with alarm, and the cumulative effect of that cycle was a consumer relationship with sweeteners that has never quite settled into the uncomplicated acceptance that cyclamate enjoyed before 1969. Outside the United States, cyclamate continued to be used without the interruption the American ban created. In Canada, in the countries of Europe, in markets that assessed the same evidence and reached different conclusions about what it required, the sweetener remained on shelves and in products, and the people consuming it did not develop the health outcomes the original study suggested they should. The absence of those outcomes became part of the argument that American advocates made for revisiting the ban, and the FDA did revisit it more than once without reversing the original decision in a regulatory environment that found it easier to maintain an existing prohibition than to dismantle one. The ghost of cyclamate is most present in the taste memories of people who were adults in the early 1970s, who remember a specific sweetness in a specific can of soda that subsequent reformulations could approximate but not quite reproduce. The tab that existed before the ban tasted different from the tab that came after, and the people who noticed the difference noticed it the way you notice any small subtraction from something familiar. A changed note in a song you know well, a room rearranged in a way that is not wrong but is not quite right. The soda continued. The sweetener did not. And somewhere in the space between those two facts is the particular flavour of a decade's relationship with food science and public fear, and the difficulty of putting something back once it has been taken away. Flying in the 1970s had a quality that is almost impossible to reconstruct today. A looseness, a casualness, an ease of access that extended all the way to the front of the plane. Passengers walked to their gates without passing through anything resembling a serious security checkpoint. Friends and family came all the way to the boarding door to say goodbye. Cockpit doors were often left open during flight, and passengers sometimes wandered up for a look at the instruments and a word with the crew. It felt like a world that still trusted itself, or perhaps had not yet learned the specific lessons that would eventually transform air travel into the layered, documented, screened experience it became. The hijackings of those years were the slow accumulation of proof that the openness had a cost. The airport in the 1970s was a different kind of public space than what it became. You could walk someone to their gate without a ticket of your own, could sit with them in the plastic moulded chairs near the window and watch the planes being loaded on the tarmac, and feel the particular combination of anticipation and melancholy that departures produce, and then embrace them at the door of the jetway, and turn around and walk back through the terminal and out into the parking lot without having been screened, documented, or questioned about your intentions. The airport was, in this sense, simply a place where the city's ordinary life extended to the edges of the tarmac. The experience of the flight itself carried that same quality of ordinary trust. The seats were sometimes wider. The meals that arrived in foil trays were actual meals, recognisable as food, served with silverware that was metal rather than plastic, because the logic that treated a metal fork as a potential threat had not yet been applied to the question of what to hand a passenger with their chicken. The drink cart came through with a completeness of offering that the current stripped-down service does not resemble, and the atmosphere of the cabin was closer to a restaurant at altitude than to the managed transit experience that flying eventually became. The cockpit was the most remarkable element of this openness. Pilots in the 1970s operated in an era before reinforced doors, before the specific prohibitions that now govern access to the flight deck, and the informal access that passengers and crew had to the front of the plane was understood as one of the pleasures of flying rather than as a vulnerability. A child might be invited to stand in the doorway and look at the instruments, the altimeter and the horizon indicator, and the radio equipment spread across the panel, the pilots explaining what they did with the calm authority of people who understood their machines and were comfortable sharing that understanding. It was an experience that generated wonder, and that is now simply not possible in any form. The hijackings that occurred through the 1970s were numerous enough to constitute a genuine pattern, and not numerous enough to produce the wholesale transformation of airport security that a later attack would require. They were responded to with incremental measures, screening procedures introduced in stages, metal detectors installed at some airports and not others, the regulatory response moving at the pace of institutions that had not yet grasped the full dimensions of the vulnerability they were addressing. The experience of flying changed in degrees, each degree prompted by an event, none of the degrees amounting to the complete reconceptualization of airport security that the following century would eventually impose. What was lost in that reconceptualization is not easily described without sounding like an argument against the security measures themselves, which it is not. The measures exist for reasons that are not abstract. What was lost was a texture of trust, the particular feeling of a public space that operated on the assumption that most people in it were simply going somewhere, and that the infrastructure around them could reflect that assumption, rather than the exception to it. The goodbye at the gate was a small thing. The openness of the cockpit door was a small thing. The weight of the metal fork in your hand at 30,000 feet was a small thing. And they are gone now, all of them, replaced by arrangements that are safer and that feel, in ways that are difficult to name precisely, like a different relationship between a country and its own citizens in transit. Children in the 1970s worked, not in the shadowy, hidden way the phrase child labour now suggests, but openly, ordinarily, in ways their parents and communities considered natural parts of growing up. Paper routes started before sunrise. Summer jobs on farms began young enough that the child doing the work was still small enough to fit between the rows. Family businesses expected children to participate in the actual labour of the enterprise, not as a lesson, but as a genuine contribution. The Fair Labour Standards Act existed, but its protections were uneven, and in agriculture especially, the rules allowed for working conditions and hours that today's standards would prohibit. For most families, it simply felt like how things worked, and the children working generally agreed. The paper route was perhaps the most universal of these arrangements, the job so embedded in the idea of responsible American boyhood that it appeared in the same cultural shorthand as the bicycle and the baseball mitt. You would rise before the neighbourhood in the particular dark of an early morning that belongs to nobody except the very young and the very determined, and you would fold the papers with a practiced efficiency that came from weeks of learning the specific origami of the thing, and you would load them into the canvas bag that hung from your handlebars and set out through streets that were still cooling from the night. The sound of the bicycle on empty pavement, the smell of newsprint and dew, the satisfying thud of a paper landing on a porch. These were the textures of a job that asked something real of the body at an age when the body was ready to be asked. The money was real too, which mattered in a way that is easy to underestimate. A child who earned their own money in the 1970s had access to a kind of agency that was not available to children who simply received an allowance from parents. You could spend it on what you chose. You could save it towards something larger. You could feel, in a concrete and unambiguous way, the relationship between effort and result, and that feeling had a texture and a weight that no classroom lesson about money could fully replicate. The paper route customer who paid you on Friday afternoon and said good job, son was delivering something beyond the weekly wage, a recognition of work performed and standards met that children understood even when they could not have articulated what they were understanding. Farm work was different in character, but similar in what it demanded. The agricultural exemptions in the labour laws of the 1970s permitted children to work on farms at younger ages and for longer hours than the rules governing other industries would have allowed. And in farming communities this felt less like a legal technicality than a reflection of how farming actually worked. The harvest did not wait for school schedules or for the child to reach a particular birthday. The work was there, the family needed it done, and the children were part of the family workforce in the same way they had been for generations before the industrial economy created the category of childhood as a protected period, separate from productive labour. The heat of a summer afternoon in a field was real heat, and the fatigue at the end of a day of it was real fatigue, and the children who worked through both came away with something that their parents believed was essential, and that the children themselves often internalized as a kind of pride. Hands that knew what work felt like, a body that understood what it was capable of, an early acquaintance with the satisfaction of finishing something hard. Whether these outcomes justified the conditions that produced them is a question the era did not much ask, because the era was still operating inside a framework in which work itself, at almost any age, was understood as inherently formative rather than potentially exploitative. The changes that came were gradual and uneven, driven by advocacy organizations and by researchers who documented the specific harms associated with child agricultural labor, the pesticide exposure, the machinery accidents, the educational interruption that came from missing school for harvest season year after year. The gap between what the laws permitted for farm children and what they permitted for children in other industries narrowed slowly, and in some respects remains wider today than child welfare advocates believe it should be. What the 1970s child who worked understood, in the way that direct experience teaches things that no other method quite can, was that the world required effort, and that effort produced results, and that both of those facts were better learned young than encountered for the first time in adulthood without preparation. The paper thumped on the porch in the early morning dark. The row of crops was finished by afternoon. The money was counted at the kitchen table, and the child who did those things carried the knowledge of them forward into a life that was, in some quiet and durable way, shaped by having been asked to contribute something real before the world was legally required to protect them from being asked. There was a toy in the 1970s that sat in the toy aisle in its cheerful yellow box and promised children something genuinely magical, the ability to bake real food. Not pretend food, not Play-Doh approximations of food. Actual tiny cakes and cookies produced by actual heat, in a tiny oven designed specifically for small hands. The source of that heat was a single incandescent light bulb, and that bulb got hot. Genuinely, seriously, surface of a pan hot, well past 350 degrees inside the cooking chamber. Children burned themselves, more than occasionally, and the general response of the era was something close to a shrug, an acknowledgement that sometimes things are hot and children learn, and the toy remained on shelves and under Christmas trees for decades before anyone decided the design needed rethinking. The box made the promise in colours bright enough to be visible from across the toy aisle, a child in an apron beaming over a tiny finished cake. The oven rendered in cheerful yellows and pinks that suggested a domestic world scaled down to exactly the right size for a child who wanted to participate in the real business of the kitchen without waiting to be old enough for the full-size version. The toy was aspirational in the specific way that the best children's toys are aspirational. It did not pretend to be something it was not. It genuinely delivered a version of the thing it depicted, and that genuineness was precisely what made it so appealing, and precisely what introduced the element of risk. The baking worked. That was the essential fact around which everything else organized itself. You mixed the packet of powder with the specified amount of water in the tiny bowl with the tiny spoon. You poured the batter into the tiny pan. You slid the pan into the slot at the side of the oven with the pushing tool, because the interior was too hot to reach into directly, and you waited. The waiting was the hardest part, as waiting always is for children, and the smell that emerged during it was real. A warm baked smell that rose from the toy oven and spread through the room with the authority of something actually cooking. When the timer indicated the cake was done and you slid the pan back out and turned it onto the tiny rack, and the tiny cake sat there, browned on top, dense in the middle, genuinely edible, the satisfaction was enormous and completely earned. The burn risk lived in the gap between the instruction and the impulse. The instruction was to use the pushing tool, to keep fingers away from the interior, to handle the pan with care. The impulse, which any adult who has ever been a child will recognize immediately, was to reach in, to touch, to confirm with the fingertips what the eyes were already reporting. The interior of the oven that produced a real cake was also an interior that could produce a real burn, and the children who discovered this did so in the direct and unambiguous way that heat communicates its nature to the curious. The burns were treated at home, in most cases, with the running of cool water and the application of whatever the household kept for minor injuries, and then the child returned to the kitchen, and the Easy Bake Oven continued its place in the room as though nothing of significance had occurred. The pain was real but brief. The lesson, as the era understood it, was the point. You learned where the hot parts were because you encountered them, and having encountered them you knew, and knowing was understood as sufficient compensation for the cost of the learning. The redesigned version that arrived in the early 2000s replaced the incandescent bulb with an enclosed heating element that produced controlled warmth without accessible hot surfaces, addressing the burn problem in a way that also altered the fundamental character of the toy. It still baked. The cakes were still real. But something in the relationship between the child and the heat had changed, a layer of engineering now standing between the curious hand and the consequence of curiosity, and whether that layer represented progress or protection, or simply a different set of trade-offs, is a question that depends entirely on which side of the burn you are standing on. The Easy Bake Oven of the 1970s sits in memory as a particular kind of object, one that delivered exactly what it promised and asked something real in return. The cake was worth it. Most children looking back would say the burns were survivable, and the experience of making something real with their own hands in their own small kitchen was worth every cautious moment of the waiting and every incautious moment of the reaching. The toy trusted children with something genuine. The children, for the most part, rose to it. The debate around raw milk is one that has never entirely gone away, but in the 1970s it was not really a debate at all in many parts of the country. It was simply a product that some farms produced and some customers preferred, exchanged directly, without the legal architecture that now surrounds every aspect of commercial dairy. People who sought it out talked about the taste, about the cream line that formed at the top of the jar, about a richness that the pasteurized version sitting in the supermarket cooler could not quite match. The bacteria those same customers were also potentially consuming were not part of the conversation, at least not until outbreak after outbreak in the late 70s and 80s made the conversation unavoidable. The drive out to the farm was itself part of what the raw milk customer was purchasing, though they would not necessarily have described it in those terms. The gravel road, the sound of the car slowing at the gate, the smell of the place, hay and manure, and the particular clean outdoor smell of animals kept in open air, which is different from and not unpleasant alongside the smells of the city or the suburb the customer was driving in from. The transaction that happened at the farm door or at the small refrigerator kept in an outbuilding was embedded in a set of sensory details that the supermarket, however convenient, could not provide, and those details were part of why the customer came back. The jar mattered too. Glass usually, because the farm supplying raw milk in the 1970s were operating outside the mainstream commercial dairy system and were not purchasing the paper cartons and plastic jugs that the industrial supply chain used. Glass had its own qualities, a weight and a coolness in the hand and a clarity that let you see the product inside, the line where the cream ended and the thinner milk below began. You shook it before you poured, the cream breaking up and incorporating with a turbulence visible through the glass, and the milk that came out was thicker than what came from a carton in a way you could see and feel and taste. The illness risk was not uniformly distributed. A healthy cow on clean pasture, milked with careful hygiene and stored immediately at proper temperatures and consumed within a short window, carried a meaningfully different risk profile than raw milk from a crowded operation with less rigorous handling. The customers who sought out specific farms whose practices they knew personally were making a different calculation than the customer buying raw milk at a market without knowledge of its origin, and the outcomes across those two populations were not identical. But the regulatory system that eventually restricted interstate sales was not designed to make those distinctions, and the rule that emerged treated the category as a whole. The outbreaks that accumulated through the late 1970s and into the 80s were not dramatic in the way that food safety crises sometimes are. They were scattered, initially, illness in one family connected to a local farm only after the fact, a cluster of cases in a small town investigated by a health department with limited resources. The connections were made slowly, and the picture they built when assembled was of a product that produced serious illness in vulnerable people, in children especially, and in pregnant women and the elderly, with a frequency that the regulatory system eventually decided could not be accepted as the cost of a preference. The FDA mandate arrived in 1987, and the map of raw milk legality became the patchwork it remains today, reflecting the ongoing negotiation between public health requirements and the genuine preferences of consumers who have decided the risk is theirs to take. In the states where it remains available, raw milk is purchased by people who know what they're choosing and have made the choice deliberately, which is a different situation from the 1970s farm transaction, casual and neighbourly and largely uninformed about the specific terms of the exchange. The jar is the same. The cream line is the same. The taste for those who seek it is still the taste. What has changed is the weight of knowledge that now accompanies the pour. The regulatory landscape around firearms in the 1970s had gaps and openings that would register as significant today. Private sales moved guns between individuals without the documentation that later became standard. Mail-order purchases, restricted but not yet eliminated, allowed transactions that bypassed the local dealer entirely. The culture around firearms in rural and small-town America was casual in a way that felt continuous with a much older tradition, one in which guns were tools rather than political objects, passed down through families and traded between neighbours without much ceremony or paperwork. That casualness carried its own consequences, ones that accumulated slowly enough that most people living through the decade never quite connected what they were seeing to the ease with which weapons circulated around them. The gun in the cabinet or the closet or the rack above the fireplace was simply part of the furniture of many American households in the 1970s, present in the same matter-of-fact way that the toolbox in the garage was present, useful for specific purposes and maintained with a practical familiarity rather than a political one. In rural households especially, the firearm served functions that were concrete and uncontroversial. Hunting in season, the occasional necessity of dealing with a predator in the livestock, a general preparedness for the range of situations that a life conducted at some distance from immediate help might require. The gun had a job, and the job was understood, and the object and the job together did not feel like a statement about anything beyond themselves. The passing of a firearm between family members operated on the logic of inheritance and gift, rather than the logic of transfer and documentation. A grandfather's rifle passed to a grandson at a particular birthday, or upon a particular occasion carried the weight of family history and the particular tenderness of a meaningful object entrusted to the next generation. The paperwork that would now accompany that transfer did not exist, and its absence did not register as an absence, because the frame within which the transaction occurred was entirely relational rather than regulatory. The grandfather knew the grandson, the family knew the gun. The idea that the state needed to be party to the exchange would have seemed, in that context, like an intrusion into something private and personal and already well understood by everyone involved. The gun shows that existed in the 1970s were community events as much as commercial ones, gathering places where collectors and hunters and people with a general interest in firearms moved through rows of tables and handled things and talked with sellers about calibers and conditions and the history of specific pieces. Private sellers at these shows could complete transactions without the background checks that licensed dealers were required to conduct, and that asymmetry, which became known eventually as the gun show loophole, allowed a significant volume of firearms to move through the secondary market without the documentation the primary market required. Most of those firearms went to people who would never cause harm with them. Some did not. The consequences that accumulated were not evenly distributed. Urban communities, where the density of population brought the circulation of firearms into contact with the specific conditions that produce violence, experienced outcomes that the rural households in which the casual culture of gun ownership had developed did not recognize as connected to their own practices. The disconnection between the culture that produced the casualness and the communities that bore the concentrated costs of it was a feature of the debate that made resolution difficult, and that remains a central difficulty today. What the 1970s bequeathed to the decades that followed was not a single policy, but a set of habits and assumptions about firearms that were durable enough to persist long after the conditions that had produced them had changed. The gun in the cabinet was still there. The family that owned it still remembered what it was for, and the country it existed within had become, in ways that those families often didn't register as relevant to themselves, a different place than the one in which the habit of ownership had originally formed. Save perhaps the best for last, because this one cuts differently than the others. In the 1970s, children left the house in the morning and were not expected back until dinner, or until the streetlights came on, whichever came first. They ranged through neighbourhoods, through empty lots, through woods and creek beds, and the backyards of neighbours they barely knew. They settled disputes without adults. They invented games without instruction. They fell out of trees and rode bicycles without helmets, and came home dirty and scraped and perfectly fine, and nobody called the police, and nobody filed a report, and nobody questioned whether the children had been adequately supervised. It was a different relationship between childhood and freedom, and whether it was dangerous or beautiful or some complicated mixture of both is a question the era did not particularly think to ask. The morning release was its own ritual, low-key and complete. Breakfast finished, shoes located, door opened, and then the day stretched out ahead with no particular structure imposed on it from outside. The neighbourhood was a known world in the way that a known world is known only to children who have spent hundreds of hours inside it, every shortcut memorised, every useful tree identified, every backyard assessed for its accessibility and the temperament of its dog. You move through this world with a fluency that came from accumulated experience rather than from any map or instruction. And the fluency was its own form of competence, real and felt and quietly satisfying. The empty lot was a central institution of the 1970s unsupervised childhood in a way that requires some explanation for anyone who did not experience one. An empty lot was not simply a piece of land without a building on it. It was a resource, a territory, a place that belonged to the children who used it in a way that no adult space could quite belong to them. It might contain interesting debris from a previous structure, useful materials for building something temporary and probably inadvisable. It might have a slope good for certain games and bad for others. It almost certainly had a section where taller weeds and grasses grew, and that section had its own interior geography, that children who spent time in it knew the way readers know the interior of a familiar book. The games that emerged in these spaces were not games that came in boxes with rules printed on cards inside. They were invented, negotiated, modified, argued over, and eventually settled through the social processes that children apply to these situations when no adult is present to apply a different process. Someone proposed a thing, someone else objected. A compromise was reached or was not reached, and the group fractured and reformed around a different proposal. The social education embedded in this sequence, the learning to persuade and to yield and to identify the difference between a disagreement worth pressing and one worth releasing, was not labelled as education. It was just what happened when you were trying to figure out what to do with the afternoon. The injuries were real, and they were part of the texture of the thing. A scraped knee from a bicycle fall was treated at home with whatever lived in the medicine cabinet, and then the child went back outside, because the afternoon was still there and the scrape was not a reason to end it. A twisted ankle from a tree required some ice and some rest, and eventually the same return to the outdoor world that a scraped knee required. The injuries were calibrated to the activities in most cases, which is to say, they were the ordinary injuries of bodies learning what they were capable of through direct encounter with the limits of that capability. What has changed in the decades since is not that the world became more dangerous in any measurable aggregate sense, but that the perception of danger shifted in ways that transformed how childhood was organised in response to it. The fears that came to govern how children spent their time were not proportionate to the actual risks, as researchers who studied the question found repeatedly, but they were real as fears, and real fears produce real behavioural changes regardless of what the statistics say. The child who might have spent a Tuesday afternoon in the creek bed is now enrolled in something supervised, scheduled, transported to and from, and the creek bed is still there, but it belongs now to a different kind of afternoon than the one the 1970s produced. The streetlight was the signal, and the signal was understood by every child in the neighbourhood without needing to be explained more than once. When the lights came on, you turned toward home. The direction was known, the pace was unhurried. The day was finished in the way that a day is finished when it has been fully used, and the child who came through the door at that hour carried in their body and their mind the accumulated experience of hours spent entirely on their own terms, in a world that had trusted them with the afternoon and received them back, dirty and hungry and completely, specifically, irreplaceably alive. There was a particular sound that belonged exclusively to the very early morning in certain neighbourhoods across 1970s America, a sound so quiet it could only be heard by the light sleepers and the very young, the soft clink of glass bottles being set down on a concrete doorstep before the sun had fully committed to rising. The milkman had come and gone before most of the household was awake, leaving behind the cold, sweating evidence of his visit in the same spot he had left it every Tuesday and Thursday for years, and the family would find it there when the first person came downstairs to start the coffee, the bottles cool to the touch and beaded with condensation in the morning air. The milkman himself was a figure the neighbourhood knew without necessarily knowing well. He moved through the pre-dawn streets with the practised efficiency of someone who had learned every driveway and every doorstep on his route so completely that the work had become largely physical, the body knowing where to go while the mind remained in whatever quiet place early morning permits. He drove a truck that was recognisable by its sound, a particular low electric hum in some areas, a diesel rumble in others, and the people who heard it from their beds knew, without looking at the clock, what time it was, and that the day had not yet properly begun. The bottles were part of the texture of the morning, in a way that paper and plastic have never quite replicated. Glass holds cold differently than plastic, more completely, more honestly, and the milk inside a glass bottle tasted of its own freshness, in a way that was perceptible even to children who had no vocabulary for what they were perceiving. The cream that had risen overnight sat at the top of the bottle in a thick, pale layer, and shaking it back in before pouring was a small ritual that connected the person in the kitchen to the basic physical facts of what milk was before homogenization smoothed those facts away. The exchange that sustained the arrangement was conducted mostly in absentia. You left the empty bottles outside the night before, rinsed and waiting, and the milkman took them and left full ones in their place, and the accounting was handled through a small notebook or a weekly bill left in the box, and the whole system operated on a trust so embedded in the routine that it barely registered as trust at all. It was simply how the thing worked, a small loop of exchange that connected a household to a dairy and a route driver to his customers in a relationship more personal than anything the supermarket supply chain would later offer. The decline of the milkman was gradual and then sudden, driven by the expansion of supermarkets and the introduction of larger refrigerators that made the weekly shopping trip a viable alternative to the twice-weekly delivery. The economics shifted against the route model as the supermarkets achieved efficiencies of scale that the individual delivery truck could not match, and the doorstep bottles disappeared from neighbourhood stoops one by one until their absence was simply the new normal, and the memory of the clink in the early morning became the kind of thing people mentioned with a particular softness in their voice, the softness reserved for things that were good and are gone and cannot be fully explained to anyone who did not experience them. What the milkman represented, beyond the practical business of dairy delivery, was a model of commerce that was rooted in relationship and repetition, and the particular reliability of someone who showed up where they were expected, when they were expected, without needing to be reminded. The doorstep was always ready, the bottles were always cold, and the morning always began the same quiet way, which is its own form of grace. The telephone in a 1970s American household occupied a specific place, usually in the kitchen or the hallway, mounted on the wall or sitting on a small table that existed for no other purpose, and its presence in that place was so fixed and so permanent that the phone and the spot it occupied felt like a single object rather than two. You knew where it was without looking. You knew the sound it made, the specific ring that was your household's ring, different in some neighbourhoods from the ring of the family next door if you were on a party line, and you knew from the first ring whether the call was likely to be for you or for someone else based on nothing more than instinct and the accumulated pattern of who called at what hour. The cord was the defining physical characteristic of the telephone relationship in those years, a coiled length of plastic-covered wire that connected the handset to the base and that determined the geography of a phone conversation with absolute authority. You could move as far as the cord allowed and no further, which in a kitchen installation meant you could reach the refrigerator or the counter, but not the living room, and the negotiations that took place in families over who controlled the kitchen phone, and for how long were negotiations shaped entirely by that physical constraint. Privacy required leaving the room as much as the cord would permit and speaking quietly, which was never quite quiet enough. Teenagers understood the telephone cord as both limitation and landscape. The stretching of the cord around a corner into a hallway, as far from the kitchen as physics and the mounting bracket would allow, was a daily exercise in the pursuit of a conversation that felt personal rather than communal. The cord would be stretched to its full extension, pressed against the doorframe of the hallway, and the teenager on the other end of it would conduct their social life in a half-whisper that the rest of the household could hear perfectly well and pretended not to. This was the arrangement, and everyone understood their role in it. Long-distance calling was a different category of experience entirely, governed by the awareness that each minute of connection was accumulating a cost that would appear on the monthly bill with a specificity that made the conversation feel simultaneously precious and pressured. Families who had relatives in other states developed a set of practices around long distance that balanced the genuine desire for connection against the financial reality of the per-minute rate. Calls were timed. Conversations were efficient in a way that contradicted the emotional content they were often carrying. News was delivered quickly, questions were answered directly, and the goodbye was a negotiation between the warmth of the connection and the awareness that the meter was running. The party line, still present in some rural areas in the early 1970s, introduced a social complexity that the private line did not contain. You lifted the receiver and listened before dialing to determine whether the line was in use, and if it was, you replaced the handset and tried again later, and the other household on your line did the same for you, and the whole arrangement required a baseline of cooperation and courtesy that was mostly honoured and occasionally spectacularly violated. The neighbour who picked up mid-conversation, out of curiosity, providing the kind of drama that small communities have always generated from the friction of close proximity. The payphone extended the telephone's reach into public space in a way that gave the 1970s city and town a particular texture it no longer has. On corner after corner in bus stations and diners and the lobbies of bowling alleys and the foyers of movie theatres, the payphone stood in its chrome and glass booth with a directory hanging from a chain beside it, and the dime or the quarter that activated it connected you to anyone in the directory, which was to say anyone in the world you were likely to need to reach. The booth offered a version of privacy in a public space, a glass enclosure that separated the caller from the surrounding noise and the surrounding observers just enough to make the conversation feel contained, and people used it for everything from the routine to the urgent to the calls that changed the direction of a life, all conducted in the same booth with the same dime and the same directory hanging by its chain. And so here we are, at the end of a day that was never really just one day. It was a decade, a way of moving through the world, a particular relationship between people and time and the places they called home. We have walked through the leaded air and the unlocked cockpits and the backyard lawn darts and the smoking areas and all the rest of it. The things that make us wince a little now, the things that make us laugh, and the things that make us sit quietly for a moment and think about how much the world can change inside a single lifetime without anyone sitting down and formally deciding that it should. But underneath all of it, underneath every segment and every story we moved through tonight, there were just people. Ordinary people filling their tanks and packing their children into station wagons and sending them out the door in the morning with a wave and a trust that the neighbourhood would give them back by dinner time. People who worked hard and loved imperfectly and made the best decisions they could with what they knew, which is the only thing any of us have ever done or will ever do. They did not think of themselves as living in a complicated era. They thought of themselves as living. And there is something in that worth carrying forward, not the leaded gasoline or the unsecured car seats, but the quality of presence those years contained, the willingness to let a day unfold, the habit of knowing your neighbours, the particular peace of a summer evening when the work was done and the streetlights were coming on and there was nowhere else to be. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the world outside goes quiet, let that be enough. A warm room, a soft blanket, the ordinary miracle of a day completed. Rest now. You have earned it, and we will see you next time.